Okay, Tool Time, right off the bat, you make two mistakes. First, you call anti-statism anarchy. Now, I did this for a very long time as well, so I don't want to beat you up on this. But just for clarity's sake, it would make sense to not use the term anarchy or anarchism. Anarchism refers to a general school of economic thought between the industrial and marginalist revolutions, and it is closely related to communism. Unfortunately, the anti-statists are deeply embedded in their linguistic error, referring to themselves as market anarchists. They have nothing to do with anarchy. And this may be the one thing that the anarcho-communists, or I should say anarchists, have correct. But I'm assuming that you are using the term anarchy to mean anti-state, and it seems that's how you're using it. So from now on, I'm just going to translate everything every time you say anarchy to anti-state. You say that you are a skeptic of anti-statism. Now, this is why I don't believe you've heard a lot of arguments for a stateless society, because a stateless society is what we are left with when all prescriptions fail. Furthermore, I do in fact explain how a stateless society could function in my short little book. Whether I succeed or not is up for interpretation, but I do in fact make what can be considered a positive case for a negation of the state. But more importantly, many better books have been written, and the two I will refer to are The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman and For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard. Those are the only two I will recommend. My book is a bit more distilled, but it's not as deep as those. My book is only about 480 book pages. Then you go on to assert how one can pragmatically justify the state as well. You just say that can be done. Where was this done? Like social contract? I'm going to bring that up. From what I can tell, the state is rarely, if ever, most people don't ever bother justifying the state in their own mind de novo. It's always just assumed, and then all discourse continues from there. Okay, now you go into the main point of your video, which is that the practical freedom of a stateless society is identical to a statist one. Okay, this is really basic. Historically, the forced cost of suppression is greater than the tax revenue that can be extracted from a population if the population is kept in line by force alone. Or more succinctly, the state cannot be sustained by force alone. The primary thing that sustains the state is ideology. This need not be deeply held patriotic fervor, just a resignation to shutting up and paying your taxes is all that is needed. When a state does try to sustain itself by force alone, you get guerrilla wars. For example, the amounts spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are higher than the GDPs of both Iraq and Afghanistan, and so the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are dependent on a huge well of ideological support back in the U.S., right? And so they can extract taxes from the U.S. to then spend money on war in another place, which is higher than the taxes they could possibly extract from Iraq or Afghanistan. Also, saying that without a state you need 100% consensus doesn't make sense in any way. If there is a dispute over the criteria of land acquisition, let's say, that is, you have one group of people who believe that land can be abandoned for 6 months and still owned, and one group thinks land can be abandoned for 12 months, then the groups would split and have their criteria of ownership, but agree to respect the property titles under each other's system. Right? So even though they have different criteria of ownership within their system, they will respect titles across systems, even though they're required in a different way because they're from different systems. Or let's say there's a town that wants to have free public schooling from ages 6 to 12. What they can do is factor in the school cost into the utility bill, or they can say that in order to buy and retain contingent ownership of a house in the general area, you have to agree to pay for various public services, and people would know that going in. If you don't like it or change your mind, you can leave and go to a more atomistic area. But what makes this better than a state solution is the polycentric nature of a stateless order. First off, you can actually leave a community, whereas you cannot leave living under a state. And so states have territorial monopolies and aren't regulated by people leaving very much. That's why states control the roads and airports and build walls at the border to prevent people from leaving. And to the extent it is difficult to go to another country is the extent to which the state that you are already in can do things which violate your subjective value. Right? The harder it is for you to leave, the more they can screw you over. This should be pretty simple. Furthermore, all states on the planet together today function as a land cartel. Now, I don't believe that this was planned from the top down. I believe that this all emerged, and I have a previous video where I go talk about the emergent state, and I talk about that. But anyway, I'm just explaining how this has evolved. All states on the planet together function as a land cartel. For example, if the United States had a 40% flat tax, but all other states on the planet had a 10% flat tax, then all of the productive people would leave the U.S. and go somewhere else. But if all the states together raised taxes to 40%, then there would be no point for the subjects of one state to go to another. But barrier between states allow for some disparity in the tax rates. For example, let's say taxes in the UK, all told, right, at all levels, are 50%, whereas taxes in the US, all told, are 40%. I'm simplifying for this example. Why don't you see every single productive Briton move to the US? Well, because moving is a hassle, and there are immigration restrictions. And this is a feature that does not exist in a stateless society. For your spitting on the sidewalk example, no, they would use force against that person and kick him out. Right? The sidewalk is a public service. If one person is going against the community rulings, then I imagine force would be used against him in a stateless society. Maybe not put a bullet in his head for spitting on the sidewalk, but they do something. They can find things to fuck with you. Okay, I don't know who you've been talking to. And legitimacy is just a matter of belief. Now, I don't think the state is legitimate, and I believe that if people knew what the state was and analyzed the state, they would agree. That is, people already believe that the actions of the state agents take today, they believe that those actions are illegitimate, but they just haven't connected the dots, right? They're looking at, well, murder and theft is bad, we need the state, but they haven't connected the dots. Wait, the state's doing that and the state's not, they're applying, and I think subconsciously they're applying a different standard to the state. Now, the thing about the mob ganging up on a minority, you're ignoring stick. An example would be Mormons and polygamy. Maybe you don't like polygamy, and if you could press a button, you would end it. Let's just say you don't, and if you could press a button, you could end it. And let's say the majority doesn't like polygamy. Are they then going to mobilize, get guns, and forcefully prevent polygamy? Another example would be prohibiting alcohol. Let's say a slight majority of people oppose alcohol consumption. Are they then going to take weaponry and burn down the saloons and use force against anyone who tries to make alcohol? I would say not. The reason things like that happen in a statist society is because you have belief in the state. Right? What the state says is controlled to some extent by voting. So if 60% voted to ban alcohol, then that becomes law applied to 100%. And the taxes that all 100% pay go to police that enforce that law that only 60% wanted. Now, a certain amount of majoritarianism is just a fact of reality. Okay, but the thing about a democratic state is not that it's majoritarian, but it's the absolute nature of the majority rule, right? It's how 51% of the population determines the laws that the 49% must live under, right? Whereas in a stateless society, if you had 51% agree to one criteria of ownership and 49% agree to another, it would be virtually, two societies. Some areas, cordoned off from each other, some areas interacting with each other, right? And it would be roughly about the same, and nobody would pay much mind to which one was actually bigger, right? Because you go where you wanted to go, right? And that's the difference between what I call emergent majoritarianism and straight up, democracy, which brings the people's hammer down on you. And another thing, what you're doing is you're conflating law with the state. Nothing more to say here. People against the state are not necessarily against law or the violent enforcement of the law. And you're right, a gun's a gun, and if you steal, well, it may depend on what you steal, but okay, let's just say, if you assault, murder, or rape, then you will be staring down the barrel of a gun. And in fact, I believe that the enforcement in a stateless society would be far more responsive to criminal behavior. And that is actually one of the things I like about the stateless society. And ToolTime, let me say sometime, anyone who argues against the state for using violence per se is retarded. Right? authoritarian. That's a pacifist argument. The problem with the state is not the violence per se, but it is the arbitrary and fiat nature of the state's land claim, and this arbitrary and fiat nature can only be sustained if most people believe in it. And that's what's problematic with the state. And by being arbitrary, they can do arbitrary things. I'm rambling here. I'm done here. My book is in the description if you care. I also have a channel where I go, line by line, talking about, making a case for the stateless society. So you can watch that if you care.